In this lesson, we're going to talk about preferences. Preferences are choices that the user makes that the application should respond to in terms of what the user wants to see, and it should also persist it so that it's remembered the next time the application is run. Also, preferences can be used across applications. So for instance, if I had a suite of applications that I wanted to provide a common theme to that the user was able to choose, then we could set what is called a shared preference. In this application, we're going to do a pretty simple preference. We're just going to have the preferred text box width. And when they set that preference, the text box will adjust its width. Now this could all be done within a database. We could certainly use a local data store and store whatever kind of user information we wanted to in there. But Android provides an entire system for this, and as well provides the ability to share the preferences between applications. So it's actually a better choice than just making custom database. In our constructor, we'll read the preferences first. And we're going to get the preferences in private mode, which means these are the preferences that just apply to this particular application. And the object that we get is an iShared preferences. It's an interface because these preferences can also be shared preferences in different modes, which means they're actually slightly different objects, but they all implement the same interface. In this case, we're looking for a text box width preference. And we'll get that as an integer value. And the second parameter is just a default. If the text box width preference has not been set, we'll just use 300 for the value. This is very similar to the old ini file system on Windows. So, once we've gotten that width, we'll go into the text box layout parameters, width, and set the text box width. So we're honoring the preference that had been set in any kind of previous runs of this application. And then we request the layout of the text box to have it actually adjust to that width. It doesn't do it automatically. Next thing we have is the button handler for setting the preference. So again, we get the iShared Preferences interface. And in this case, we're going to get an editor. So we have a shared preference editor object, and it's just right off of the preferences edit method. We get the user's desired text box width. Make sure that it really is an integer. And then we use the editor to put that integer into our text box width preference. And finally, we commit that. So you could see how we could go through and put a number of different preferences before we actually did a commit. Now, in order to actually see that preference happen, or if another application was setting preferences that we were concerned about, we implement an interface on the activity called iShared Preferences onShared Preference Change Listener. That's a mouthful, isn't it? And the only method we're really concerned about is the onShared preference changed, which essentially occurs anytime the user has changed a preference and it's been committed. So it passes in the preferences interface and a string key. In our case, we read the key, and if it is indeed the text box width, which we implement, we read the preferences and go back and set our width and relay out the text box. So we can see this in action. And there's the initial text box width. And I'm going to make it very small. And there it goes. And if I go back in and make it a touch bigger. We can see that. Now I'm going to close the application and restart it to see that preference was persisted. And indeed, you can see that the text box width persisted that 125 number that I used. So that's how you can implement user preferences.